every other seat, every other row, or something like that. Like, I would like to see more than 11 people allowed if possible. I want to, of course, like you say, be safe, but it seems like with everybody going into restaurants and school, I just read that the school mask mandate is going to be coming off. It appears that it seems like we should have maybe every other seat or something like that. That's just my 2 cents.
Mayor, this is Ashley. If you can hear me, I did some work last week on this very thing and worked with HR in particular with the reduction of the number in seats. 11 was very draconian, and that was just as we were poised to jump into Omicron. I moved some things around in the council chamber, again, worked with HR and got us to 27 seats, which is about half the seated capacity. That's not including staff, and that gives us adequate spacing with the windows open. So I don't know if that helps this discussion anyway, but that's how the chamber is currently set up for test purposes right now for tomorrow in the event that you vote to move forward with this item.
Actually, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well done. So, Council, what's your comfort with the 27 number? Okay. All right. So if we'd have a motion then to go ahead and move the staff recommendation with the inclusion of 27 people, that'd probably be appropriate.
Well, you'll need me to read the title first, Mayor.
That'd be lovely.
This is an urgency ordinance of the City Council of the City of Carmel-by-the-Sea adopting rules of conduct at city facilities.
Mute your device for a minute.
Yep.
Jeff, were you talking to anybody in particular?
No, I'm trying to get myself situated. Sorry.
Mayor, I'll make that motion that we move to have 27 citizens allowed. However you say it.
Let me try to phrase that for you. It would be a motion to waive further reading and adopt the urgency ordinance with the modification of 11 members of the public to 27.
That's my motion.
I'll second it.
Motion and a second. Any other discussion? All right. Could we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Barron.
Yes.
Councilmember Ferlito.
Yes.
Councilmember Tice.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Richards.
Yes.
Mayor Potter.
Aye.
Unanimous.
All righty. Thank you. Appreciate that. Now let's move on to my second attempt at public comment. The rules have not changed. It's an opportunity for any member of the public to speak on an item not on tonight's agenda. 3-minute limitation on that testimony. If you'd state your name for the record, I'd appreciate it, as always. Anybody wishing to testify tonight? Not hearing anyone, I'll close the public comment period and move on to extraordinary business. We do have one item before us, that is receive a report and presentation from the city's outside legal counsel regarding telecommunications codes, and to conduct an early public workshop related to drafting a citywide wireless telecommunication ordinance. So that you have the unique experience where we have the Planning Commission in concert with us, a joint meeting. I want to thank the Planning Commissioners, Chair LePage, for your leadership in bringing us all together here. Good idea. And I think this is the most appropriate forum to have a discussion on a very complicated topic. So Brian, I don't know if you want to kick this off, or Chip, did you want to lead in? Or Brandon?
Mayor, if I could make a couple of introductory comments, and Mr. Purick may as well. Yeah, I want to also echo your thanks to the Planning Commission for being here. It's a very important topic, very germane for this day and age. It's been almost 20 years since we updated our wireless telecommunications facilities ordinance. In that time, obviously laws have changed, technology has changed quite a bit. Accordingly, this is a prime opportunity for our decision makers to take a look at the changes in the law and technology and potentially update our ordinance. You're going to receive you received the PowerPoint deck earlier today. It's a pretty lengthy presentation. That's because there's an awful lot to cover. It will cover topics such as the limitations on what we can regulate, what other cities have done to address wireless telecommunications facilities and the like. In the end, we do recommend that you take public comment and then ask us to prioritize this potentially. In about a week, you do have our retreat when we're going to talk about priorities. This may be something that you want to queue up for action sooner rather than later. And we're real happy to have a lot of people that represent and protect us that'll be making the presentation today, and not the least of those are Mr. Pierik, of course. You did receive some correspondence about this topic late last year and as early as the last couple of days. So all of that has been transmitted to you, Council. So I'll stop my comments there, Mr. Mayor, and again, Mr. Pierik may have some introductory comments as well.
Thank you, Chip. Brian, the floor is yours.
And I just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce, for those that haven't met them previously, Trip May. He's with the Telecom law firm, and he's the managing partner at that firm. And that firm specializes and practices exclusively telecommunications law. And then also Gail Carish of the Best and Krieger firm. Gail as well devotes a substantial amount of her practice to telecommunications law. So these are two very experienced lawyers. They have put together a program that you will see when I stop talking, and it will provide you with information regarding, as Chip has indicated, it's been many years. I think it goes back to 2004 or something like that, that you last updated your telecommunications ordinance. So there, in fact, have been many changes in both technology and the law as well that you'll hear about from Trip and Gail. To give you just kind of a heads up, this is going to be somewhat technical. That's true for two reasons. One is we're talking about the technology of telecommunications, the facilities and where to locate them, and their power, et cetera. And then the law. The law is not simple. And so it is going to be a bit complicated. However, the presenters have substantial experience with this. They're going to do their best to explain it for everyone. They are available to answer questions that you or the public may have when they've finished with the presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Trip and Gail.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, Mayor Potter, Chair LePage, members of the City Council and the Planning Commission. My name is Trip May, and Gail Carish is here with me as well, of course. I'm going to try to share my screen. Sorry, go ahead, Gail, while I do that.
I just said good afternoon, and I realized we never did discuss about who's going to handle the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can keep it up while I'm speaking to you, and we don't have any glitches.
Yeah, well, telecommunications lawyers should be able to handle this. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So to begin with, we have some prefatory matters. First one is there's pending litigation, and a big question will be about whether we can talk about it. And the short answer is we cannot. This doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. I like to have questions from the City Council and the Planning Commissioners as we go along. I will let you know that this is going to be a rather long presentation. We may get to some of your answers later on, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have at the end. So if you'd like to save them, that's fine too.
Procedurally, I'd like to have the questions saved till the end.
Fair enough.
That way we can get through your presentation first.
Yeah, and just so you know, Gail and I can talk about this stuff until we are blue in the face for hours.
That won't happen tonight.
We'll not do that tonight. As staff has made it abundantly clear that we are not supposed to do that. So, but we want to talk first about what the city of Carmel does. So how does the city currently regulate wireless facilities? Well, you have a chapter in your code, 1746, it's part of your zoning code, and it was adopted about 18 years ago. And it is pretty germane to codes that were adopted 18 years ago. It applies to all types of wireless facilities, no matter where they are or what they are. It has the same types of application materials, same types of location and design criteria, same findings for approval. And it requires to go through a normal type of zoning process. That usually means conditional use permit design review. And that requires a trip to the Planning Commission for an initial decision and a possibility of an appeal, which can take some time, right? That's not a short process in and of itself. And when we get to the discussion about timelines, Gail will explain why perhaps we should be making some adjustments for certain types of facilities. And some of those facilities you've seen already. So in the course of time, that chapter has netted you wireless facilities in the city of Carmel. They exist, but they're almost exclusively on private property, some of which are on public property, but they're always on or outside of the right of way. They're building mounted or facade mounted, so your rooftop facilities or side of the building type facilities. You have almost nothing in the public right of way. In fact, when we looked, we don't think that there was anything ever approved there. But there has been a growing interest in the public right of way for a number of reasons that we'll discuss. But as you've probably seen in the recent past, there's been an increase in applications to use infrastructure in the streets for support for these types of wireless facilities. One other thing I'll note here is that you don't have any freestanding towers. Good or bad. One thing we'll talk about is whether there's opportunities for that and the way in which improvements in concealment may open that door for you. Naturally, the question is, what are these things and how have they changed over time? They've gotten smaller and better looking. And just to give you an idea about why we would talk about this in the first place, I want to stop here and mention that what these things are and how they operate is really important for a lot of the legal concepts that we're going to discuss when we get to that point in the presentation. And primarily it has to do with the fact that when the rubber hits the road and the city doesn't like what's being proposed, either by its location or the way it looks, or whether it should be approved at all. The question is there going to be any technically feasible way for the carrier to provide their services by doing something better, or in a different location, or with a different configuration of equipment or a different design? And knowing what the equipment is, the technology is, and what is available in the alternative is a big step forward in being able to figure out what the scope of your local authority is. By the same token, the FCC has total field preemption over engineering and technical matters when it comes to the architecture or the technical decisions that a carrier makes when it comes to what kinds of facilities they want to deploy. So to give you an example, there's a case out of New York where a city said, we only want right-of-way facilities. We don't want big facilities either on towers or on rooftops. And they developed an ordinance that effectively made it impossible for anyone to develop one of those big facilities, but really easy to develop smaller facilities in the public right-of-way. But that code was struck down because it regulated what the facilities were rather than what they looked like. And that is a very fine distinction, especially when we are talking about not moving them from one type of technology to another, but perhaps one type of equipment configuration to another within the same technology family. So understanding what these facilities are and the types of technologies that the carriers are proposing to use is a really important foundational block for understanding what the scope of your authority to say yes, no, or yes in a different location or in a different configuration really entails. So there are layers to this technology. And this slide kind of summarizes it in a very simple way. You can think about it in three slices. The top layer here is what we call macro cells. These are big, wide area, tall towers, building top facilities that provide coverage using frequencies that go long distances and penetrate walls really well, that provide that umbrella coverage that everybody's going to need to do things like make a phone call, especially something like 911. As more people start to use the equipment and the network, and especially in areas where there might be a lot of built environment, like a downtown setting, or in areas where there's a lot of changes in the topography, hills, canyons, and things like that, it becomes harder for those bigger facilities to shine their signal into those nooks and crannies. And that's where that middle layer comes in, that outdoor capacity layer. And these facilities are the types of things that go on utility poles, streetlights, They're smaller facilities. Sometimes they can go on buildings as well. But what they do is serve two essential basic functions. They either close small holes that just can't be reached by big facilities, or they offload traffic in areas where big facilities can reach with their signal, but they can't provide a quality level of service. And so one way you can think about this is a sprinkler system, right? So if your yard has a lot of changes in topography in it, you might place one sprinkler head in the middle and it covers most of everything, but you might need some dribblers elsewhere just to make sure that everything else is covered. If you don't have those like mix of different types of facilities, then the system doesn't cover the entire yard. And that's essentially what's going on with these different types of facilities. There are another layer of facilities that go indoor, and those don't concern us very much. Those are the types of things that are like range extenders inside the house that don't have any impact on the aesthetics of the building, or within a mall or a sports stadium. We don't worry about those too much. It's the top two layers of this that really concern us. So I'm going to talk about what's in these facilities too. It's basically the same across all the different types of equipment you're going to see. Whether it's a macro facility like you're looking at on this slide, which is unconcealed just so you can see what's there, or a small cell, which I'll show you on the next slide. There's going to be antennas on one at the top, usually with some amplifiers or smaller radios to help distribute the signal near the antennas, with base station equipment, which usually involves baseband radios, things that connect the signals from the antennas down to the broader equipment and communication network at the bottom, and utility equipment. So if you compare this, which shows you what's on a rooftop and on a freestanding tower, to this, the equipment is the same, right? And this illustrates why you might want to have both of these types of facilities in a network, or a heterogeneous network like the previous slide showed us. It gives us different lanes. And when we're adding on top of that different technologies like 4G to 5G, it is creating bigger pipelines for data to flow. So it's relieving pressure from existing macro facilities that provide that umbrella coverage. It is allowing bigger data packets to flow, not just through existing pipelines, but to transition from one side to the other and over different frequencies. And the overall effect is like adding lanes to a freeway. That's not to say that the only thing that's changed is how much data can go through the pipe. They've gotten really good at concealing these facilities too. So you saw those photos before. These are really excellent examples of freestanding facilities. One of which is in Northern California. It's that water tank looking facility that you see on the right. And another one is a clock tower that's functioning, you see on the left from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And even the fake trees that don't always look real have gotten much better. This is a fake mono eucalyptus, was what they call it in Oceanside. And traveling down the freeway at 65 miles an hour in Camp Pendleton, you can't tell the difference, because not only is it really well concealed in and of itself, but it's placed in the right spot near natural looking trees of the same type of size and shape. I've got a few other examples to help break this up to show you some different types of building mounted facilities that you might not even recognize as wireless facilities. And these were things that we would call complete stealth. You just don't notice that there's wireless facilities inside the structure. Even when the antennas are exposed, if they're placed in the right spot, they can look natural. And again, it looks like a stealth facility, like something you would expect to see without knowing that it's a wireless facility in and of itself. Another example, this one's from Long Beach. And even when we're not fully concealing the equipment or just hiding it behind existing parapets, the carriers have gotten creative about using different types of mounting to make sure that it doesn't extend above the parapet wall. So in this case, the equipment is on the rooftop, but because there are houses that can see that rooftop, they've lowered it on an A frame instead of an H frame so that it doesn't peak above that parapet wall too far. The antennas, by the way, are off to the left side, following down that cable over the parapet wall side. And in some cases, when there's really no better option, carriers have gotten very creative and used this as public art. This is an example from my neck of the woods in San Diego. It's off the 5 freeway on your way down to the California-Mexico border. And it is nice to look at when you're sitting in traffic. It's certainly better than what you've seen before. I'm going to give you one last photo of macro facilities. And this is one that I like because you can definitely see where the 2 fake trees are, but you probably did not see that fake rock off to the left side, where you can use topography to help conceal the equipment without having to have that freestanding tower. In Carmel-by-the-Sea, you're more likely to see facilities mounted on utility structures because there are no freestanding streetlights. So here's a few examples of what you might see elsewhere in California. The one on the far left is a twofer, right? This is a co-location involving a Verizon facility and what I believe is a T-Mobile facility. The Verizon facility is at the top of the pole, and the T-Mobile facility is on the strand itself that goes between the poles. It's those gray boxes there. And then these other facilities here in the middle and on the left, you can see these are more typical of what you might notice if you're just driving around. They're mounted either at the top of the pole or on standoff brackets, side arms, what we call them. The one in the middle shows the equipment placed in a box at ground level. And the one on the far right shows the equipment placed on the pole itself, above grabbing height. This photo is taken from PCH in Malibu. And I like to use this one because it shows 2 different examples of when the policy of using existing structures rather than placing it on something new can sometimes backfire on you. So in this case, both of these, the front one I believe is a AT&T facility, and the one in the rear on the Sycamore Canyon sign, those are, I believe, T-Mobile facilities. But using those existing poles is limiting because they're wood, meaning you can't run the cables through the pole itself. So they've got to run on the outside, and you can't conceal the mounting brackets or integrate the antennas into it. By comparison, and showing you something perhaps worse, you can see what happens when you add multiple facilities on top of those existing poles. So sometimes co-location, which we used to prefer when we're only dealing with macro facilities, can look worse on poles in the right-of-way, right? So you take something where it's already hard to hide because it's a box on a pole in the middle of the street, and then you add more boxes to that same pole, sometimes just becomes double ugly. By contrast, moving this to a dedicated pole or replacing the pole that already existed can sometimes be a better option. So this is an example from Rancho Palos Verdes where they have horse crossings. And instead of placing a new facility in the public right-of-way, they've replaced an existing street pole, wayfinding pole, and then use this as a way to hide the equipment off to the side. You can see it over on the right-hand side of your screen, like nestled in those bushes. It's all within the public right-of-way. But it moves the equipment and reduces the amount of bulk that you see. Same thing can be said for replacing poles altogether. So this is an example from San Diego. This was a streetlight, concrete Amaron type pole, pretty typical of what you see down here, not typical of what you see in Carmel-by-the-Sea, but just an example of how if you replace something, you can get a better outcome sometimes because you can reduce the amount of total equipment that's being placed on the pole, and you can get a custom built structure that is designed with the handholds in the right place to hide the mounting brackets and the conduits designed to prevent all that excess wiring that otherwise looks pretty ugly. In an extreme excellent example, this is the Old Grove at Ole Miss. It is a historic site. At this university is a place where kids gather all the time and they're always on their cell phone. So they needed cell phone service, but they couldn't place any of the types of facilities you've seen in any of the other slides there because it just wouldn't fit with their historic preservation rules. In this case, the antennas are actually in the luminaires themselves, and you can see the engineers working on it. So those lights light up, but they also emit wireless signals. The equipment and the radios are placed underground at the base. And so this is not something that you can get every time, all the time. It's a very expensive type of facility, but it gives you an idea of the range of creativity and concealment that is available, even when we're talking about putting a box on a pole in an open space. And it's not just limited to poles, right? So there are applications that involve other types of street furniture, kiosks, or bus shelters like this one. And in this photo, you can see this guy is installing a wireless facility on top of this thing that is just dedicated to providing service to the people who are waiting for the bus, right? So you can watch YouTube videos on your way to work, on your way home. And it has the same equipment. It's small radio units, low power antennas, and you put a radome over the top, and the equipment for the utilities and the baseband units are placed underneath the seat that you can't see below the worker. So there have been a lot of changes, both good and bad. And in the concealment phase, there's been a lot of expansion. On the legal side, there have been, I'll say, a mountain of things to talk about. And when I said at the beginning that we could talk about this for hours and hours, we certainly could. And when we talked to staff about it, they said, please don't do that. When we gave you the staff report, that has everything that you really need to understand about the detail that goes into everything that's happened since 2004. This presentation is going to be focused solely on the highlights, right? What is the key takeaways that you need to know? So I will be taking the federal law side, and then Gail will be taking the shot clock timing aspects of it and some of the key changes on the state law side. So jumping right in, we have Section 332C7 of the Telecom Act. This is the granddaddy. It's the base law. This is the federal law that applies to all wireless facilities of all kinds that provide personal wireless services, basically cell phone services. And it has two main features. The first one is that it preserves all of your local authority unless it gives you a specifically enumerated exception. So sometimes when we're going through these presentations, a question will come up about, well, why are we always talking about what we can't do? And the answer is, we can do anything we want unless we've been told we can't, right? So that's why we focus on what we cannot do in some of these presentations. So you're going to hear a lot of can'ts or a lot of musts, but it's just remember that all of your local zoning authority is preserved unless you've been told by the feds of the state that you have to do something different. Within the context of this statute, there are 5 major exceptions. The first one is that you can't actually or effectively prohibit personal wireless services. So actually is pretty easy. A blanket prohibition on personal wireless service facilities is pretty obvious to spot on its face. Effective prohibition can be harder. One denial of a permit can effectively prohibit the provision of personal wireless services if it prevents the carrier from being able to provide those services or complete its network. And so that's where we start getting into a lot of that technical discussion about, well, if it's not going to meet our standards, what else could you possibly do? The second major important one is that you can't unreasonably discriminate against functionally equivalent service providers. This is a personal favorite of mine because you can now reasonably discriminate amongst competitors. And I like to stop on this one because it often comes up in discussion about, well, if we say yes to one thing, are we locked into saying yes to that, to the same type of thing forever? And the answer is no. Unreasonably discriminating does not include changing your mind based on different circumstances, including changes in circumstances over time. So if you approved one thing because it met your criteria for approval at time A, but you change that criteria when the same application or similar one comes to you in time B, you're not necessarily required to approve it just because it would be discriminatory. It's not unreasonable to say that your standards have changed. The third one is pretty important. It's that the FCC controls the field when it comes to the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions. They set the standards. We can check for compliance with those standards, and if a facility does not meet those standards, we can certainly deny it. But if it does meet those standards, that's the end of our inquiry at the local level when it comes to the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions. The last two are procedural in nature. We have to give a decision within a reasonable amount of time. And as Gail will tell you, the FCC has spilled a lot of ink explaining what that means for various different types of applications. And we must give a written decision based on substantial evidence. And that written decision doesn't just mean yes or no, it means the reasons why you said yes or no. And the substantial evidence standard is the usual standard for administrative review, meaning it's pretty deferential to local governments. So long as you are able to tie your decision to a finding required for approval in your code, something that was authorized for the basis of your decision, to a reasonable amount of evidence that somebody would accept as supporting your conclusion, even if reasonable minds could disagree, then you've met that standard. So that's the basis law. That's it. There are different categories of facilities that have developed over time. So one big one are eligible facilities requests. In 2012, Congress adopted this statute that said there are going to be modifications or changes to existing facilities that local governments just can't say no to. You have to approve them if they meet certain standards. And one of those standards is that it doesn't substantially change the physical dimensions of that existing facility. A very important factor in that test that the FCC has enumerated is that the changes can't defeat existing concealment. So if the existing facility was like one of those ones I showed you very early that doesn't have any concealment on it at all, you're kind of up a creek. But if it does have existing concealment, and if it was designed to look like something other than a wireless facility, and the change would make it look like something other than what it should have looked like, meaning it no longer looks like a fake tree, then you can still deny that application and make it go through the discretionary process. This is basically like a filter. And I want to stop and pause on that idea of what defeating the concealment means, and especially pause on the basis requirement, meaning it has to be a stealth facility, meaning designed to look like something other than a wireless facility to even get into this category. So the first example is fake tree. If you have a fake tree that's got a nice canopy over the top of it, the branches go beyond the antennas, it really covers it up, makes it look like an actual tree, and they want to change that so that the antennas are poking out, changing the silhouette of the tree, making it no longer look like a fake tree. Now it just looks like a furry tower. That would be a good example of something defeating the concealment. In the alternative, we've got something like this, which a normal person would say, yeah, that no longer looks as concealed as the original did. So going from the left side of your screen to the right side of your screen. But the problem is that left side of your screen facility is not designed to look like something other than a wireless facility. It's a wireless facility with some aesthetic modifications to it, but it doesn't look like a fake tree. So even though they wanted to expand that and now make it look like a lollipop up the side of the road, it doesn't defeat the concealment because there was not really concealment to begin with, because the original aesthetic conditions weren't intended to make it look like something other than a wireless facility. This is important to think about when you're contemplating what kind of standards you want for new facilities, before they get modified. If we're going to approve something new, shouldn't we really be focused on making sure that it's stealth, looking like something else? Along the way, the FCC has put out a lot of different orders. Here's a list of key ones. I don't want to go through all of these because I know that you've got it in your packet, you've got it in the staff report, but I think it's important, especially when you hear the types of additional changes in the law that Gail will talk to you about, to realize that we're dealing with something new every other year, almost every other year. And the frequency at which things are changing is increasing. And if you go through this list, you'll also notice that that same pattern I mentioned is repeating itself. We have all our authority unless someone takes it away. So all of these FCC orders, except maybe the first one, is taking away or chiseling away at that local authority. So it is complex, it is ever changing. The two most important ones are probably the most recent ones, and they were issued in 2018, became effective in 2019. The first one is the Moratorium Order. It says exactly what it's supposed to do. It says no more moratoriums. So we used to use this kind of tool to hit the pause button and evaluate the technology and the law and come up with the right solution for the community involved. Can't do that anymore. We have to do this on the fly. A moratorium won't stop what's called the shot clock, which is the measure of how much time you have to render a decision under the FCC's rules. And if you put one in place, it may in and of itself be an effective prohibition on the provision of personal wireless services and other telecommunication services as well. The second order that's important is the small cell order. This one sucks a lot of the air out of the room because it creates another new regulatory category for small wireless facilities. This order says that for these types of facilities, you got to act faster, and there's going to be different rules that you have to act under. There's pole attachment fees that don't affect us so much because they're pretty similar to what we already had under California law. But when it comes to aesthetic regulations, it would be an effective prohibition under the small cell order for a small wireless facility if our regulations were not reasonable, which according to the FCC means technically feasible, getting back to that concept of whether it can work or not, and published in advance. All right, so we need to make sure that we are also not just thinking about whether we've got all of our bases covered, but whether we've said them in not just a code, but maybe some design standards as well. Question comes up a lot, what's a small wireless facility? Well, it's not that small. It can be up to 50 feet tall or 10% taller than the adjacent structures if they are above 50 feet. Each antenna can be no greater than 3 cubic feet, but there's no limit on the number of antennas that you can have. And then all the other non-antenna equipment can't exceed 28 cubic feet. And it's hard to picture this in your mind, so I'll give you some photos to think about. This is one from UC San Diego near where I live. The equipment that you see below is greater than 28 cubic feet cumulatively, but each one of those boxes would be less than 28 cubic feet. And the antennas that you see above are four feet long, but they're still less than 3 cubic feet in total volume individually. A good example also here from Beverly Hills, this one has 6 feet long antennas, but because they're so thin and so narrow, each one is less than 3 cubic feet. And that box that you see in the foreground on the left-hand side of the screen is less than 23 cubic feet. So it definitely meets that standard. The FCC does not require you to approve anything that meets those volumetric standards. It just uses this as a template to say anything that is less than these standards we've set forth at 50 feet tall, 3 cubic foot antennas, no more than 28 cubic feet in equipment volume, that gets subject to new rules, right? And as I mentioned, Gail is going to walk you through now what some of those rules are with respect to the timing of your decisions. And Gail, when you need me, just let me know and I'll advance the slides.
Great, thank you, Trip. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Just as a reminder, when Trip talked about the federal law that was adopted in 1996, it had those 5 things that limited local authority. One of them was that you had to act within a reasonable period of time. And the FCC in several orders now has come up with time limits for acting, which they call presumptively reasonable periods within which to act, or colloquially, they call them shot clocks. And there are different timelines we'll see in a moment for different types of applications, all these categories that Trip has been talking about. And not only is there a reasonable period within which to act, but there's also a what I call like the shot clock within the shot clock, and that's the time to respond to an application and determine if it's complete or not. And it's one of the ways you can actually pause a shot clock. There's only two ways you can pause them. One is by agreement with the applicant, and the other is through the issuance of a timely notice of incompleteness. So you have to base your notice of incompleteness on publicly stated requirements. And your first notice of incompleteness becomes almost like a punch list for the future review when you get a resubmittal and application of the application and you send another notice of incompleteness. If you can go, yeah. So what you doesn't mean you can't ask for other things that aren't on your list. You just cannot control the shot clock by saying that you didn't get something that wasn't on the list. The time limits and are eat into the time period, overall time period for review as well. So being speedy on reviews and getting your notices of incompleteness out is really important as well. One last point on the shot clocks before I show you the chart is I'm going to talk about mostly federal shot clocks, but there are also shot clocks under state law. And the federal shot clocks do not stop. As Trip mentioned, they don't stop for moratoria. They almost never reset to zero. There's one exception, one time for small cells, and they run independently of any state law shot clock. So you really have to watch all of these timelines in reviewing applications because going past one of them can have consequences or remedies for the applicant, even though you may be within your period to act under a different shot clock. So with all those prefaces, I'll show you the list. So there is no wireless facility that doesn't have a shot clock now. The FCC has been very busy issuing all sorts of orders, establishing them. So eligible facilities requests that were discussed already, 60-day shot clock, you have 30 days for your first notice. But remember that if you took all 30 days, then you'd only have 30 days left to finish your review and make your decision. For any subsequent incompleteness notice, when you get a response back from the carrier, you actually have only 10 days to send your next notice out. But of course, those all eat into the shot clock period. For small wireless facilities, they have two categories. They have co-locations, that's basically placing a facility on an existing pole, 60 days. That has only a 10-day review period for the first incompleteness notice. And the very first one will reset the clock. So you get your notice out in 10 days, you'll start at 60 days when the response comes back in, but then the subsequent notices are all 10 days. The other small wireless facility shot clock is for new or replacement support structure. So if you have to take a pole out and put in a new pole to put in the facility, you have 90 days overall, the 10 and the 10. For any co-location, we're putting a facility on an existing structure, and that structure doesn't have to have wireless facilities on it already. That could still be a co-location under the FCC rules. So say on a rooftop of a building, but there is no wireless facilities on that building right now, that would be a 90-day shot clock, 30 days to review, 10 days for resubmittals. There is a separate state law that's in place now for a period of only 3 years. I think there's 2 years left on it that requires you to approve generators. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And that has its own state law shot clock, 60 days with a 10 and 10 day for reviews. And then the final one on the list is the kind of catch-all. If you didn't fall under any of these other categories and it's a wireless application under the FCC rules, you have 150 days. So that typically is like a new macro wireless tower, 150-day shot clock. So you have all of those shot clocks, and those are important not only because it's a requirement of federal law, but as we'll see in a moment, there are also some impacts under state law. So, but before I turn to that, the basic premise in state law, we've been talking about facilities, how these new smaller wireless facilities are going more and more in the public right of way. And so that's where state law has an impact here in terms of cities' rights. And that's because decades ago, the state determined that telecommunications is a state matter and not a local matter. And so in the Public Utility Code, telephone companies were granted a statewide franchise to use the public right-of-way. So they can use the streets in any street or county for the placement of their facilities, but there are some limits on that franchise. And one is that the placements cannot incommode the public use of the streets. And that's where local authority comes in really in terms of permitting and protecting not only for local safety, but also the aesthetics of the facilities that get placed in the public right-of-way. Another is Section 2902, which pertains to public utilities, preserves local regulation of the placement of facilities by utilities in the public streets, but subject to the authority where the PUC has adopted rules that may preempt local authority. An example of that is the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, has pretty detailed rules regulating the safe placement of infrastructure, utility infrastructure in the public right-of-way. And those rules would preempt any local rules where they overlap. An important decision in 2019 confirmed something that we had understood based on some federal court decisions for a decade before that, but confirmed the local authority to regulate based on regulate the aesthetics of placements in the public right-of-way. But remember, this is under state law. You still also have to comply with federal law and everything that Tripp mentioned on federal limits on aesthetic regulation as well. Next slide. There are some other state laws, a variety of them that have been adopted over the last couple decades that prohibit various things. For example, a government code prohibits requiring an escrow deposit for removal of a facility. So as a condition of approval, you might require a deposit to remove the facility at the end of the permit term. You can't actually require a deposit, but you can require a bond. You can limit, under state law, you can limit the term of a wireless permit to 10 years. But if you want to go less than 10 years, it's only if you have a public safety or land use reason for a further limit. And you cannot require all facilities to be located on sites owned by particular parties. And what that really means is you couldn't, for example, say, we only want wireless facilities on government-owned properties in the city. You just can't do that under state law. There were also two different bills that have been adopted, and this is going back to the shot clocks that I mentioned and why they're important. The shot clocks that were adopted under federal law do not have a deemed granted remedy. The ones under Section 332, those 5 shot clocks, but under state law, they do. So if you were reviewing an application and you didn't act on time, you may have a claim by a carrier that the city didn't act within the shot clock period, and they may invoke under state law a deemed granted remedy which kind of puts the burden on the city to go to court and prove why it is acting within a reasonable period of time, or why the presumptively reasonable period of time under the FCC shot clocks shouldn't apply to them. So that's a really important development in state law, and part of it happened in 2015, and part of it was just in this last legislative session that expanded that deemed granted remedy to include small wireless facilities. The one other federal shot clock eligible facilities, or for eligible facilities requests, has a deemed granted remedy already in the federal regulations. The next government code section, that's another law that was adopted, I mentioned briefly already. It temporarily has made a category of emergency generators as a special category of applications that must be approved if the generator request meets the requirements under the state law. There are some specific requirements as to the size of the generator and things like that. It only applies to macro cell sites, and you don't have any in your city, so I wouldn't be too worried about this law. It doesn't apply to rooftop facilities. It doesn't apply to small cells or distributed antenna systems. And then finally, there's another code provision that I won't spend too much time on that had the idea of kind of pre-approving a facility and co-locations to the facility, but it is very rarely invoked, and so it's not all that important to worry about. Next slide. And then just one more word, just to be clear on the safety regulations. Compliance with health and safety regulations is always paramount. There's no doubt about that. Nothing in what we've talked about in terms of shot clocks and deemed granted remedies and anything like that is intended to require the city to allow an unsafe facility to be constructed. So there are safeguards and protections built into those laws with respect to health and safety. But some issues, as we mentioned, are preempted at the local level. And the most important are that the FCC sets the standards for safe RF emissions exposure, and we can't regulate that at a local level, and that the California Public Utilities Commission has very detailed rules on what are safe installations or safe infrastructure, utility infrastructure in the public right-of-way, and that includes safe separation from power lines, and the strength of poles and their ability to withstand wind and other loading and things like that. And so I'm going to turn it back to Trip to mention a few more things about how to deal with all of this in your ordinance, but just as a kind of a recap, you've heard that from us that federal and state law created a lot of new regulatory classifications, all these small cells and co-locations and eligible facilities requests and all of that all have different special rules and timelines for action. The timelines have been getting shorter. There are deemed granted remedies to worry about. And so those are kind of on the negative. On the more positive side, we continue to have the ability to regulate aesthetics, although there are some limits on that ability. And even the FCC rules allow for reasonable regulation. And finally, the RF exposure standards that you are preempted from establishing your own. There were some court challenges to the FCC. There's been a lot of pressure on the FCC to try to update those standards because they are quite dated. But as of today, they remain in effect and remain unchanged from how they were adopted back in the late 90s. So I'm going to turn it back to Trip now to talk about how you take all of this and turn it into your own wireless code update.
Yeah, so you're all experts now. There won't be a test, but we do have some do's and don'ts to try to pull it all together and help understand what this means for crafting effective strategies at a local level for making sure that you've got all the tools in the box you need to regulate these facilities in compliance with your local aesthetic and community values, while staying in compliance with this Byzantine structure of different regulatory and procedural rules you have to follow. Here's the big 3 points. First of all is that flexibility matters, especially when it comes to these new classifications of facilities with their own special rules. You might have noticed there's a lot of overlap, right? Section 332C7 applies to everything, but some of them are governed under 1455A, some of them are governed under AB 2124, some of them are governed under all different types of statutes, right? So, and they all layer on top of each other. And they're changing a lot, and it doesn't always wait for the legislature. The FCC has a say too. So being able to adopt administrative policies that get into the weeds of what is and isn't allowed, or what the procedure should be, is really important, because not only does it allow you to be more flexible, it takes a while to update your code, but it allows you to be more expansive, right? When a new thing shows up, we can deal with it right away. We can't put a moratorium in place, so we should do it quickly. And if we have administrative policies, then staff can adjust their application procedures potentially without going back to the city council. But if there's a substantive change in the standards or the procedures that really need to take place before something can be approved or denied, then doing it as a policy governed through resolution of the city council rather than a codified ordinance is a much more effective strategy. Second big point is dovetailing with the first, differentiate between these different categories. There are different rules, recognize them, apply them. Like, for example, in eligible facilities requests, it's a filter on modifications to existing facilities. So use those standards in a separate policy to filter out the facilities that you have to approve because you don't have any authority to say no, from the ones that you don't have to approve and you can put back into a discretionary process. And then third, consider some interdepartmental coordination. I think in general, there's going to be a mix of facilities, both on private property, which is usually the province of the planning department, and in the public right-of-way, which is usually the province of public works or engineering. And they're going to have to work together because they've only got a short amount of time to get through all the regulatory approvals or potential denials that are going to be required in order to meet those shot clocks. When it comes to aesthetic regulations, just exercise them. You know, as I mentioned, all the rules have to be publicly stated for small wireless facilities. It's a really good idea to do that for other types of facilities too. Under the substantial evidence standard, as I mentioned, the first criteria is whether something in your code or your local law, if it was adopted by a policy, allows you to say that's approved or not approved. So being specific and expansive is a really good idea. And a mix of objective and subjective criteria is a really good idea too, right? So if you know what you want, you can say that. If you're not quite sure, maybe what you would want would change based on the circumstance, subjective criteria is okay too. We just have to say it in advance. And then consulting with stakeholders, both in the community and in the regulated entities that are going to have to comply with these is a good idea as well. On the don't side, saying no to specific technologies is a no-no. Even if you know that you don't want that, you should also not omit standards for what you don't want. So if you know that facilities in the right-of-way is discouraged, we should still have standards for them, because it's going to be very difficult to have a blanket prohibition on any class of facilities, even if it's beyond the technology and just where it is. On the findings and conditions of approval, because we've got a lot of different facilities that are going to be coming through, it's a good idea to put the burden on the applicant to show us in advance that they've met those criteria for approval. It's also a really good idea to have automatic conditions of approval that you would impose on any of these applications if it got through the process, if there's a problem with the shot clock, right? So imagine a situation where the city gets a lot of applications at one time and is overwhelmed and something slips through the cracks. The best thing that you could have in that situation is those automatic conditions of approval that are just applied as a matter of law, especially things like limiting the term of the permit so that it's not there forever. It's only there for as long as it's required to be, just because of state law. It's a good idea to create some flexibility in these things too. So if you're going to go through the process of developing those automatic conditions of approval, you should create some flexibility for just in case there's a situation where compliance with those specific conditions of approval might create a problem with effective prohibitions. So delegating a narrow scope of authority to make those types of decisions is a good idea. And overall, as a strategic matter, it's a great idea to get in front of these things by making sure that your application and submittal process is tight. You only have a certain amount of time to review these applications and to make a decision. And so one of the things you want to make sure is you know when they're coming in and you know exactly what kind of application it is, which category it fits into, what type of shot clock it's under, and have a laid out process for making sure that staff can go through all the checklist items it needs to go through to put it through its paces and decide whether it fits the mold or doesn't. As far as the procedural portions of this goes, one big point that I would like to make is that you don't have to codify all of your application requirements or your submittal procedures. The FCC allows the city to just make that publicly stated. So if that authority is delegated to a department level or a department head, they can set up the process that makes sense for the city and adjust it as things change in the future and make sure that the city is protected and they've always got the most up-to-date regulations, application requirements, and completeness requirements going forward. So staff has a couple of items that we think we'd like some feedback on. If you can digest everything that we've talked to you about over the last 45 minutes to an hour, we just kind of sum them up in these three basic categories. And the first one is, should we be developing these rules and tailored procedures to each regulatory category? I think that's a helpful way to go. We've also got questions about being way more specific about what we like and what we don't like, so that we can have substantial evidence for saying yes or no to applications as they come through. And that gets down to things that include facilities that we might not like. So if we don't want right-of-way facilities, if we have to have them, would we prefer them to be taller with the equipment placed above, or would we prefer them to be down closer to the ground with the equipment placed on the ground level? Are there discouraged zones? Are there places where we really don't want to allow it unless we absolutely have to because of federal or state preemption? And the same goes for design categories. So should all these facilities be held to stealth? What does stealth mean to the city of Carmel? What do we like? What do we don't like? What do we want to give the carriers and the applicants as a strike zone for saying, if you give us this type of application, you're more likely to be approved, or if we don't get that kind of application, you're more likely to be not approved. And Gail and I are both available for questions. I know I've kind of run through this at a rapid pace towards the end because I know we're running up against an hour, but we're certainly willing to go back through anything that we've talked about and get into more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Trip. Thank you, Gail. Well done. Most informative and very complicated. Before I go to the public at all, let's ask council. Are there any questions at this time of Trip or Gail at this time by council members? And I'll ask the planning commissioners. council members? Any questions per se at this time? I don't see. All right. I don't see any. Planning commissioners, questions at this time of Trip or Gail?
Dave, I have one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert.
So probably don't want to talk about a specific application, but hypothetically, if there was only one pole, utility pole in the R1 district, let me rephrase it. Can PG&E, who owns most of these utility poles, can they deny access to those poles?
Commissioner Delvis, the short answer is yes. It's a layer, right? So we've got approval authority, they have approval authority as well. Just like any other private property owner could say no to allowing a facility.
Well, except that they do have to, I would add one qualification to that in that they are required to allow attachments to their poles, including wireless attachments. And the California Public Utilities Commission has rules about that. But they do have the ability to say no in certain circumstances or to require a pole replacement. Safety is a big factor for them. It's not about aesthetics for the utility, but more about safety. But they are required under state law to allow attachments, but as a general rule, not any particular pole.
Yeah. So like an example of that, if we're getting the weeds, would be that PG&E says no to attachments on poles that have rectifier banks, right? So when there's a blackout rolling through the system, it hits that rectifier bank and it stops. They don't allow anything to be attached to that one. And so that would be an example of PG&E being able to say no, just on their own.
So you opened the door there for private property. If Verizon or anyone approached the owner of a restaurant downtown to put an antenna on the roof, what applies and what doesn't apply here?
Nothing at that level. That's a arm's length negotiation for a lease.
So what you're saying, that's not going to go to any government body within the city, that it's a private bilateral contract over which we have no say.
And Gail might have something to add here too, but in general, it depends on how it comes up. So you typically, when a carrier is submitting an application, they will show a good faith attempt to look at all the best alternatives available. And that might include some locations where they tried to get a lease, but the property owner just said pound sand, right? There may be situations where an application comes in where they didn't look at a particular property that we think at the staff level is a potential alternative that should be evaluated. In which case it would go back to that stage of, can you get a property right to build a facility there? Is it technically feasible, potentially available to put that facility? We don't get involved in those discussions, but as another way in which it could come up after the application is submitted is if the staff says, hey, what about that property that wasn't evaluated already?
But just to put a fine point on it, none of the rules that we discussed apply to private property owners. They're all applying to the city as a regulator looking at issuing permits. And in fact, even say there was a city property outside of the public right-of-way, because the right-of-way is treated a little differently, but say a city park, the city has the same authority there to say, as a property owner, as a private property owner, to say, no, we don't want this facility in the park, for example. But that's wearing your property owner hat. That's not a regulatory function in that instance.
So I'm sorry to monopolize my last question. So in the example of a private property owner being approached, but then do design guidelines that, for example, prohibit antennas or prohibit anything over a certain height, certain prohibitions in design guidelines, are they trumped or do they apply?
They apply.
Oh, they apply to the permitting, right? So the landowner may say, yeah, you can put a facility on my rooftop, but you've got to go get a permit from the city to do that. So they can't agree to something that the city's regulations wouldn't allow.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Robert, thank you for the question. Is there anybody else? Karen Ferlito, you're on the council. Let me just make sure there's nobody else on the planning commission. Anybody else on planning wants to ask a question?
Yeah, I want to ask a question.
Michael LePage.
Michael, yeah.
Go right ahead.
Okay, I'm going to direct this to Tripp because he talked about it. This is about not being able to reasonably discriminate between providers. And Tripp brought up the hypothetical question that, does this open the door to all providers? And he said, no, if the standards haven't changed. Well, if they haven't changed, if the standards have changed, if they haven't changed, in other words, hypothetically, a antenna on top of a telephone pole, like was proposed behind the LaPlaya, was approved and the standards didn't change. So how would that affect the approval process of potentially other providers coming to the city and asking for approval? We've had a lot of concern by the citizens that this is going to open the door to all the providers because essentially there are laws in place or standards in place so that we can't discriminate between providers.
Yeah, so let's use a different hypothetical. Just any wireless facility placed on any pole or any rooftop, right? And it's still a good question because in the nature of this type of study session, we can't get into all the weeds, but it doesn't require a code update in order to say that it's not unreasonable to treat the second comer differently. So the Ninth Circuit's been pretty clear that cumulative impact or changes that happened naturally around the facility, like, for example, something that was out in the middle of nowhere just all of a sudden turned into a residential community, has given you a reasonable basis, a rational basis to say that this is not like the last circumstance, right? So even if it's in the same location, same type of pole, same type of building, or even in the same neighborhood, as long as you can draw a rational connection between why you are treating it differently and from time A to time B, you should be in reasonably safe territory. Gail, do you have any other thing to add to that?
Yeah, I would only add that, it may be that those circumstances may not come up, right? It may be that the two applications or the two proposals are both in pretty similar circumstances. And in that case, it would be, you'd have to say, well, what is the basis for denying one and approving the other under the same standards? So it's not like a pure precedent. Location matters, the circumstances matter. They're always no two applications are identical, but some of them are pretty close. So it's very fact specific and very specific to the applications you have before you.
Gets back to that substantial evidence issue, right? We need to be able to draw the connection between why we would treat them differently and explain that.
And let's keep it limited to hypotheticals. All righty. Is there anybody else on the Planning Commission wishing to ask a question? All right, I don't see anybody. Karen, we seem to be anxious to say something.
Oh, yes, I just want to ask a question. So is it true that we can ask any wireless facility to install a stealth facility or including asking for co-location on a stealth facility?
I think the general answer is yes. The no's are very in the weeds. So just to stick with the right-of-way context, if we didn't like a facility placed on an existing utility pole and we wanted to go on a new pole that's between two existing poles, there may be circumstances where the CPUC would say that's too close together for existing poles, right? Or for two poles. So there could be problems, but as a general answer, yes, we can require stealth, and yes, we can require co-location wherever it's technically feasible. Hopefully that answers your question.
Karen? Okay, head going north-south. All right, is there anybody else on council with questions or comments? Let's Chip up, sorry, you got your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question, right now we require a conditional use permit for small cells on private property. And I guess I was a little bit thrown at the end of the presentation, Mr. May. Is that prohibited currently, or is our ordinance and requirement a legacy that's been superseded by law? I'm sorry, sir. Could you clarify that, please?
Yeah, it's not expressly prohibited, but it is effectively impossible in some situations, right? So, for example, if the application was subject to a 60-day shot clock, that application requiring a CUP would still have to get publicly noticed, placed on an agenda, and get through the potential appeal process, which is 10 days plus the public notice period, plus the appeal itself, and get to a written decision all within 60 days. So for those applications, especially those ones that are within that 60-day shot clock, so eligible facilities requests, co-located small wireless facilities, generator adds to existing towers, which Gail mentioned is not really that big of an issue since you don't have that many existing towers. But those ones, they really don't fit within the CUP model for how much time we have to get through it. So not legally prohibited, but as a practical matter, very difficult to comply with.
Tripp, sorry, this is Brandon. Can you just take that a little bit further? The CUP is one thing, but we can still require design review or design study, our typical sort of administrative design permits that go along for private developments, right?
That's generally right. So there are some categories of facilities, like, for example, the generator ads, which again is not that critical for you guys, but they're defined as permitted uses, but they're subject to the same criteria that you would apply to any generator that was being added to any type of property. So you could go through a design review process if you applied that same process to all the all generators being added to any property. For small wireless facilities and for eligible facilities requests, it's pretty common for other cities to say, we can't get through this process in time. It's clogging up our agenda. We want the staff to be able to say yes or no, because it's effectively using very objective criteria, especially on the eligible facilities request side, and then allow for the potential of an appeal if there's a problem, especially like with something like a small wireless facility that has some discretion still allowed in. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, before I take it out to the public for question and comments, is there anybody else on the Planning Commission or the council that has questions? I don't see it. Somebody has their hand up, but I can't see who it is. Is that a member of the public?
I believe that's a member of the public, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Well, if there's any questions or comment, just questions by the council members or planning commissioners, I'll take it out to the public to go ahead and ask questions or comment. There is a 3-minute limitation on testimony. If you'd state your name for the record, it would be appreciated. And I see one hand up.
Good afternoon, Mayor, council members, planning commissioners, and staff. My name is Jeannie Brown, and I am Vice President and Senior Counsel for Classic Hotels and Resorts. We are the managers for La Playa Carmel and Hotel Carmel in Carmel-by-the-Sea. I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to provide some thought and some commentary. We are very hopeful that the citizens and business owners can come together and have an opportunity to provide thoughts and preferences regarding changes to the telecommunications ordinances. So we're very happy that this will be a collaborative process. I know that's been a concern of some of the residents and citizens of Carmel. And my overall question, I have a few questions, but my first observation is, I do hope that one of the objectives for outside counsel and staff will be looking to maximize potential protections for residents and businesses and to preserve the character of the city. So we hope that that'll be one of the directions for outside counsel when they're drafting these ordinances. I only say that because when I was reading the staff recommendations, I was somewhat concerned that there were a few references to possibly providing the city with more effective tools and processes to decide applications due to the concern of the short shot clocks. And there was some reference to the batch applications and whether or not it's feasible if each of these applications in a batch application would require a public hearing before the Planning Commission and then a potential appeal to the City Council. So again, just expressing our concern that we hope that with any administrative changes or ordinance changes, there isn't a desire to take some of the process out of public comment or providing an opportunity to appeal the approval or denial that's already in the ordinances of Carmel-by-the-Sea. We think that's very important. So I just wanted to make sure we expressed our concern there. And regarding stealth, I don't know necessarily if stealth was always the answer, because in a city like Carmel-by-the-Sea, this small hamlet, if you require stealth and maybe say, we want them to look like palm trees or other things, you may be impeding on view sheds and the views from certain homes and businesses. So sometimes getting really specific may not be very helpful. So just want to make sure you keep in mind the specific interests of Carmel-by-the-Sea when looking at federal and state law. And that's some of our concerns. So we just wanted you to know that we're hopeful of this collaborative process and we're looking forward to working with your outside counsel. Thank you.
Thank you for the testimony. We'll have staff answer any public questions at the end of public comments or public questioning. So is there anybody else wishing to speak tonight? Somebody's lit up, ending in.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, this is Christy Hollenbeck.
Okay.
Can you hear
Welcome.
me?
Yep, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, guys. I taught that presentation. Thank you for that presentation. I found it kind of scary. We do not want codes that will fast track installations of cell towers and streamline the application process for the telecom companies. And none of the so-called stealth facilities really would fit into our charming village of Carmel at all, I don't think. The citizens must be included in the drafting of the new wireless codes. This is too important to leave up to lawyers and some of the city staff that do not live in our community. The state wireless codes have not been updated since 2004, while the Safety Guidelines for Telecommunications Act have not been updated since 1996. The Court of Appeals has remanded the FCC to reevaluate those guidelines as they are 26 years out of date. The residents of Carmel do not want to turn our beautiful, charming village into a dystopian nightmare smart city. Numerous cities and towns are passing ordinances to restrict 5G and the proliferation of wireless antennas near homes and schools with the authority that they have. For example, Los Altos passed an ordinance that does the following. It prohibits installation of small cell towers on public utility easements in residential neighborhoods, a 500-foot setback for small cells for multifamily residential residences in commercial districts, 500-foot separation from schools, and 1,500-foot separation between nodes. Other communities have passed ordinances to restrict cell antennas near homes and schools, including numerous cities in California, such as Paloma, Mill Valley, Malibu, Santa Barbara, Encinitas, Fairfax, Palo Alto, Walnut Creek, San Diego, as well as Bedford, New Hampshire, Mason, Ohio, and more. We need more local control, not less. And I really hope that you will stand up for the city of Carmel and not update our codes to facilitate the wireless carriers. So the citizens of Carmel have made it very clear that we want to strengthen our codes and protect our residential neighborhoods. And we've collected so far 65 signatures for our petition. And I'm sure that the whole community feels this way, that we want to protect our beautiful hamlet of a village. And we don't want these horrific looking things that Tripp showed us in his presentation. I just thought that was so scary, what he was proposing. So anyways, thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. Anybody else wishing to speak tonight from the public? Again, is there anybody else in the public wishing to speak tonight? Alrighty, and last call. Christopher, did you want to speak or are you just clearing your throat?
I accidentally hit my unmute button and cleared my throat. Perfect timing, huh?
All righty. Okay, I'll close the public comment period, bring it back to staff and council. There were some questions about the process that we're going to go through as we develop these ordinances. Basically, it's a contemporizing of our ordinance to make sure we're in concert with what is legally permissible, not going ahead and changing the rules necessarily. Is there anybody else wishing, staff, do we have a comment on that process here? Brandon?
No, Mr. Mayor, I mean, maybe Chip wants to add a little bit of flavor to it, but I think the last slide that Tripp has there really encapsulates well what we're looking for. So perhaps Tripp, if you want to put that back up. Because this really comes down to some general direction and questions from the city council that we're looking for.
And if I may, I can respond to some of those comments to say that streamlining of the application review process doesn't necessarily mean that there will be no appeal. It does mean that the appeal would have to happen faster. So then in situations where we've done that in the past, public notice goes out sooner and wider in some cases, and it happens more often. So there's a notice of an application being filed, notice of a decision being rendered, and the availability of an appeal. It just all has to happen on a faster timetable. And that's not because we want to accommodate industry. It's because we want to avoid situations where failure to approve or deny through our process results in an automatic approval and thereby losing our ability to say no to applications that should be denied, or no but to applications that are almost there but need some conditions of approval in order to fit within the community's character. So community involvement will absolutely be a big part of being able to develop the standards, but the process is not intended to limit anyone's participation.
So Tripp, it seems to me that we might be a little premature then tonight in by saying, this is where we want you to go and this is what we want without the public process beginning at the planning commission level, which is what I was kind of convinced, kind of thought we were doing tonight, was actually getting a public hearing of the issues that are before and understanding the complexities of state and federal laws as they exist and the regulations that we have to play by. But I wouldn't do it. I wasn't going to go ahead and prejudge the decision of the direction today, I thought. But.
Well, I think that we can bifurcate some of those issues and not necessarily throw out baby with bathwater. So I heard we don't like what I saw in the slides. I showed you some bad slides. That's for sure. But there are procedural issues, sort of like, should we create separate rules for these separate regulatory categories so that we can always turn to them and say, this application's been filed as an EFR. Here are the rules for those. They're separate, right? And we know that they're going to change on a dime because the FCC has them in the crosshairs. Should we put those in a policy rather than codify them in an ordinance so that we can adjust quickly, not without losing any of the public input, but still quicker than what an ordinance requires? I think we can still get some good feedback here by saying, yeah, that's something that we want, or maybe we want that for some of these facilities, but not all of them, and we like these photos or not those ones. You know, there is some feedback I think would be helpful if you're going to direct us to go ahead and produce something for you to review.
Council members, what's your preference? I'm a little uncomfortable doing it this way. frankly.
Mayor, I have a quick question. This is for Gail and Tripp. Have you worked with any other cities that have developed some codes that they've had some success with, or that that have been able to build some rules or guidelines already? Is there something that we could work from?
Well, I think the answer is yeah. There was a public comment that listed off a number of California cities. I think between Gail and I, we've worked with all of them. Not all of the ones outside of California, but certainly within. And the one thing that it comes down to when you're looking at those other codes is you realize the process is about the same. There's only one way you can really get through 60 days and keep an appeal at the same time. It really comes where the differences are is in the preferences. Where are the areas of city where we have less concern? Where are the areas where we have more concern? Where are the areas of the city where we don't want to say yes unless we absolutely have to? And then determining the scope of what that means as for staff, right? We don't want to rule by exception. And so we need to come up with some standards that make this a workable process. And so I'm hesitant to give you some examples, but in the public comment, there are a number of those other California cities that you could look to that we've worked with.
Yeah, all I would add to what Tripp said, which I agree with everything he said, is every community is facing the same challenges now because, and really mostly since 2018 with the FCC orders that ban moratoria and had created these new very short shot clocks and rules for processing small wireless facilities, which are really a challenge because those are typically in the public right of way. So there are lots of communities that have already adopted new ordinances or new standards, and they're just working through how well they work now, really. So we're learning as we go and what works in some communities and what works better or worse. But the other point that Tripp made, and I really agree with, is that some of it is just local. It doesn't matter what another community did. It matters sort of your circumstances and what will work in your community and your particular aesthetic requirements, your characteristics of your community. So we can look to others for some guidance, but you're always going to have to figure out what works best in your community as well.
Council members.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, you certainly have the opportunity to provide some direction tonight on the last slide that Tripp and Gail provided. We think that this is a significant enough priority that it should be, in the top 6 or 8 things that we're doing going forward. And you can provide that kind of direction tonight. You can provide specific direction on things you'd like to see built into a revised ordinance or not. You can provide direction on process. You can delegate to the Planning Commission, and or you can wait till next Thursday when we're going to have again our priority. Our strategic planning meeting, where you'll be faced with prioritizing about 30 projects. So it's entirely up to the council, Mr. Mayor.
Jeff.
Thank you. I have some preferences on the list going back to what Mr. May and what Chip said. I think when I look at this list of this A, B, C list, most of the things under B and C, I think, are sort of under the purview of the Planning Commission. I might take exception to the backup power requirement, but I think that a lot of those things under B and C involve the aesthetics and the look and the feel of the infrastructure that we have in our right of way. And maybe one possible action would be to sort of separate off sort of the aesthetic things and the positioning requirements. I think those are all great questions, and sort of repeat this process with a slightly different presentation for the Planning Commission to get their feedback. I don't know. So for example, existing poles versus new poles. You know, one question I had for you, Trip, which I do not need an answer for, was, can we restrict these installations? You know, we have above ground power here, and so let's assume that all of the poles with power are 40 feet tall. So we have an issue. You know, would we like to have 50 foot tall towers with small cell facilities at the top, or should we require these carriers to install poles on the other side, which apparently could be significantly shorter? Like, to me, that's an important issue, and one maybe that we could decide. But I think that that's sort of the purview of the Planning Commission. And I would really like to hear on those issues that are aesthetics. I would really like to hear what they have to say first. They're the sort of group that's in charge of sort of the look and feel of the town, at least with a first try. So perhaps we could segregate off some of those things. And then most of the things under A, I think those are really decisions for us. And I do have some opinions on A, 1, 2, 3, and 4. On A1, codified ordinance versus policies accepted by council resolution. You know, I listened to what you said about the nimble quality of having some of these things be policies, and I would certainly be in favor of policies so that we can react more quickly to changes in the regulatory schemes that come down. On number two and number 4, delegate authority to community development. One of the things that really worries me here is the 60 days. And I talked to Chip about this a little bit earlier. I'm really struggling with how we're going to fit the 60-day shot clock into the processes that we have in place. So, for example, if someone, you know, if a carrier comes in on January the 20th with an application and we deem it complete, and the 60-day drop dead date is, let's see, March 19th. Our council meeting is on, you know, this year our council meeting is on March the 1st. And that 45-day time period really seems to me to present a problem. There's a lot of things that we have to do in 45 days, especially if we need to have public outreach, which we do, and if we need to have a planning commission meeting, you know, to sort of review what staff did or as a requirement, and then we need to have an appeals period. And I'm really struggling with how we get to 60 days here. And I think that issue is an issue for the council, not an issue for the planning commission. I think that those sort of procedure issues, like the 60 days, the codified ordinances, you know, do we have separate ordinances for the different types of facilities? You know, the stuff about the initial administrative decision, all that stuff, I think that's all sort of our purview. So one possibility would be that we sort of take the stuff that's the council's and put it in one basket, and take the stuff that's the planning commission's and put it in a different basket, and attack this issue with a sort of a two-pronged process.
Jeff, I'm not opposed to that at all. I just don't want to get to where we're making too many decisions. We express our opinion or our thoughts, but I'm a little afraid we go ahead and kind of prematurely direct the planning commission what they think they should do, and then we're kind of circumventing the public process, because only 2 people, I think it was only 2 people testified tonight. That's pretty limited public testimony. And I do think you're right, though. If it's a legal one, then it should stay with council. Process could stay with council too. I just want to make sure that the planning commission does what they do, and that's a good job of doing the dirty work.
May I respond?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's exactly my idea, Dave. I think it would be to sort of send all the planning commission, just to send all those issues to the planning commission. I tried not to express any opinions on the issues that I think are sort of the commission's responsibility. I just think we should my opinion would be that we just send all that stuff to the planning commission, figure out what that stuff is, and send it to them and have them sort of work through those issues.
I'd agree with you entirely. How does the rest of council feel? Bobby's thumbs up. Yeah, okay. Karen?
I'm in agreement with that. Mm-hmm.
Good.
Because it will allow more public comment as well. So more opportunities for the public as well.
Exactly. All right, well, so we've got three here. Let's go ahead and move through those then, Jeff.
I have a question.
Karen. Yep.
Yes, I'd like to hear from Gail and Tripp what they think the urgency of the time is on this. And second to that, I know it's been mentioned that other cities have done certain things already. And you said you're working through the process of what of those things are going to work or not work. But are there any cities right now that are facing challenges to their new restrictions that you know of?
Karen, that's a good question. I think that goes to Bobby's question about, are there other experiences out there that we could be learning from? That's a great question. Tripp or Gail?
I'll go first, and then I'm sure Tripp will have something to add too. Yeah, there are communities. I heard Los Altos mentioned. Los Altos, and I'm not sure of, I think they just introduced maybe a new ordinance, but I know several years ago they adopted an ordinance that had a lot of restrictions in it, and they got sued by Verizon and AT&T, claiming that their ordinance was too restrictive and was effectively prohibiting the provision of service within the city. That you would call a facial challenge, where you, in that case, the applicants also had applications that were denied. So they were both challenging the lawfulness of the denials and also challenging the validity of the ordinance itself. You don't see facial challenges too often. Usually it comes in the context of an application that gets denied, but sometimes you see them. So that's one example. There are other more common examples where there were denials under the rules, new ordinances that then got challenged in the courts. But those are pretty, fact specific to those circumstances and those applications. We've had only very recently clarification from the Ninth Circuit on what parts of the FCC small cell order were upheld and which were found to be unlawful. And so some of the regulations that were adopted back in 2019, some cities are looking at maybe potentially updating their regulations now that we have some more changes in the law. So it's kind of a moving target of what's working and which regulations are current or based on current law or based on the law that from 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to add to it, I'll give you an example of the city of Torrance in LA County. They were one of the first cities to adopt new standards for small wireless facilities right out of the gate when the FCC dropped the small cell order. But they just recently amended those standards. And it wasn't to loosen them per se. It was to reflect the fact that there was a change in the law because the Ninth Circuit said we don't have to have objective standards across the board. So they put more subjectivity into it. They also put more of the application process in the staff's hands for at least the initial decision because of that shot clock issue. There's another category of different types of examples that you want to take a look at. And those are the ones that are really restrictive. And I will just mention that somewhere in those very restrictive codes is an exception that will allow for whatever needs to be done to avoid state or federal preemption. Sometimes it's just one line, sometimes it's a whole section, but that is the key to being able to really express your values. So in an example like the city of Encinitas, they have preferred, discouraged, and restricted. And in preferred, it's no problem. In discouraged, you have to show us that there aren't any preferred alternatives available. But in restricted, you have to show that we have to say yes. And that restricted category is extremely narrow, right? It is right in front of somebody's front window in a residential neighborhood on a new pole that's ugly, right? So that's the kind of detail you have to take a look at when you're going through those types of ordinances. And I'll just say, as a general matter, Los Altos is probably the only one I've seen that's been challenged on its face, but all of these ordinances have that kind of exception process built into it, and that's what prevents them from getting challenged.
All righty, Carrie.
I think, so Tripp and Gail, you've heard our public comment when the cell phone tower issue came up. I think part of our challenge is we're 1 square mile. A lot of these other towns are much bigger. And so are there recommendations based on what you've heard from the public that you could make to some of these procedures and rules, and especially B and C, knowing our community better since you've gotten to know us?
Well, whatever we propose, we'll go with a big grain of salt, saying this is a humble presentation, and that it's just a suggestion based on what we think we know about what we've learned from working with you. But yeah, we have worked with a number of communities. I mean, for example, some of the communities we work with are entire historic districts, right? So they're small and they've got very unique circumstances, and they still find ways to make it work. So we can propose some sort of guidelines, say, here's what we think works. Tell us if we're right or wrong. How should we reorganize these preferences? Show us how you would do it differently. And then we can work with that to determine, hey, is this in bounds, out of bounds? If it's out of bounds, can we bring it back and figure out a way to affect the policy that is animating that preference?
I mean, that's what I'm looking for, because, I mean, obviously this is, as the mayor said, a very complicated, law-intensive issue. So, you know, I would like to see something that we can, and we and the public can respond to. That's what I'm looking for. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I think it does, Carrie. For me, it does. And I think, Jeff, your suggestion actually of deciding which ones we feel fall in the purview of the council and the rest which we would like to put to the planning commission. Seems to me B and C are pretty much planning commission issues for public discussion. And then you had a suggestion on an A, as I think it was 2 and 4, 3 was it, wasn't it? Or 4 and 2, I can't remember which it was. Jeff, do you want to try to put us back to that?
Yeah, my biggest area of concern, so I do generally agree with you with respect to B and C, but we could just sort of poll the council and the commission and see what they think, of course. I think my biggest concern, you know, that I talked to Chip about, was trying to get through the 60 days. And that was related to, I think, a lot of the things in A and B, a lot of the things in number A, especially numbers 2 and 4, and sort of 4 and its implication that there's no planning commission review of the things, of the decisions that staff makes, which I find maybe not such to be a good idea. I think that those are subjects for the council to decide, and we should, you know, we as a group should, I'm not sure that we need to figure it out right now, but we should task Chip maybe with coming up with a way of doing that or something. I don't really know exactly how that might proceed forward.
I'd agree with you, Jeff, that the shot clock issue is difficult given our normal calendar of meetings. So it would probably necessitate special meetings on the part of the council to make those deadlines. But I think that's one of the biggest ones, is this rush to decision that I feel we're being pressured into, which is not our choice at all. I mean, obviously coming from the federal government, but still, I think we've still got control over that if we go ahead and deal with the issues up front. So I think that's a good suggestion. Council, how do you feel?
Hey, Dave, I would add, you know, I think that your analysis that the city council special meeting, I think that that's exactly right. I think the last thing that happens in the 60 days is room for an appeal to the council. And I think that's the most problematic one. And I think that if we and the staff sort of figure out how to manage that we can probably fit everything else in, you know, with a compaction of the normal schedules. But I think it could work. But I think that last council meeting is the real problem.
Mm-hmm. All right, council members, what do you guys think? Karen?
Yes, I think Carrie is on to something here. We have our experts in the room right now. We have people who know what other communities are doing, how they're writing up ordinances, policies, et cetera, in order to be the most restrictive we can possibly be. And I think there's value in having them, after listening to the public during the last big meeting of the other cell tower application and tonight, to come back to us with their suggestions that then we can react to based on what they suggest as what could possibly be the most sensitive and most restrictive standards that we could get away with.
Karen, I think that's what we're suggesting, is that we go ahead and not necessarily say capriciously, we're just going to go roll over here. I mean, obviously we have concern about the quality of this community, but I just don't think we can get there tonight. What I would suggest is that
no,
the staff,
I'm not suggesting getting there tonight, but I
realize that, Karen, I realize that. I'm not arguing with you. Okay, so what I was going to say was, I think staff recommends at the bottom of the city council authorize staff to work with outside legal counsel to prepare proposed updates to chapter 17.46 that reflect the changes in the law since 2004, clarify the procedures and standards for each regulatory classification of wireless facilities, and provide the city with more effective tools to process and decide applications. And then staff also seeks any other feedback or comments that may be useful in preparing the draft ordinance updates for consideration by stakeholders, planning commission, ultimately the city council. I actually think, Karen, we're all agreeing here that we want to go ahead and get out there and make sure that the public's involved. We make sure we make the right decision that preserves the quality of this community. But I do think we got to make sure that we're compliant with the law too. But I couldn't agree more. I think we've got a consensus here that we want to go forward with a very, very thorough review, coming up with a very good ordinance that works with the community.
Yep.
Am I missing this? Carrie, thumbs up. Bobby?
Yeah, Mayor, if we were to recommend that to the staff, exactly as you just said, could we just add and to bring forward some of the codes that other cities did find and had success with, like the Los Altos and Torrance or wherever it may be?
Exactly. That's why I think Karen's suggestion, in agreeing with Carrie, it's right. That's what we should be doing. Because it's always cheaper to learn by other people's expense, especially if they stood the test of law. All right, so I'm going to like to hear the planning commission just weigh in here, guys. Chair, what are your thoughts on this? Michael?
Thank you, Mayor Potter. Well, first of all, my general comment is that it's pretty obvious that the federal and state requirements are trying to force local cities into a very limited approval process here. I mean, the shot clock and then the other limitations, are pretty much defining how we have to address this. So I really appreciate the fact that Tripp and Gale came up with this list of, how to break this down. And they also, I think they were very good about telling us that, the things that we need to focus on in terms of the process, what's the best way that it will work for our city in the context of what, the laws are. So I also like Jeff's idea about delegating parts of this, splitting the delegation up, getting more people involved. It also creates more of opportunity for the public to have their input. I was kind of surprised that there weren't more people at this meeting tonight, but I've seen that before, and I know the council and the commission has always made an effort to have additional meetings to get the public's input, and we all value that. So that's an important part of this process. And so I think the suggestion to delegate parts of this up, is going to create more opportunities for public input. And then last thing I wanted to say before I, get the other commissioners on this, I think the way to do this within the context of the restrictions that we have, is we're going to have to really focus on what are the priorities for the aesthetic definitions of our community. You know, what do we really care about, how these individuals' towers affect us aesthetically. And that, I think, is going to help. I think we can go to our residential and commercial guidelines, which particularly residential guidelines have a history in there about the aesthetics of our city and also the character of what we want to focus on as a people. And then we can use that to set the priorities and kind of define, you know, how we're going to set up these aesthetics, which then hopefully can become some standards to address in the application process, so that certain standards aesthetically have to be met before this application shot clock can even start. So those are just my general comments. So I'd like to hear what my other fellow commissioners have to say about this.
Thank you, Michael. Gail Lehman, I think you have your hand up, don't you?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Gail.
I thank you, Michael, for putting all of it out there so succinctly. And I'm reading, though, that this is an older news article, but it's not that old. The Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution of support for House Resolution 530, introduced by SU, a Democrat from Atherton, aimed at overturning Federal Communications Commission regulations that curtail the local control of permitting new cell towers and wireless transmitters. And I'm also reading that Los Angeles, Seattle, and 22 other cities and counties have filed lawsuits to overturn the FCC order restricting time for review. And I think this is, I'm wondering if Tripp and Gail have had any experience with these lawsuits, which seem to be all over right now, all over the West Coast, and what the results were.
Yeah, Gail and I represented all of those cities, and we had a mixed result. The Ninth Circuit law ruled against our petition on the shot clock issues. Mm-hmm. And on the fee issues, we didn't talk about very much, but they agreed with us in large part on the aesthetic control issues. So as far as the lawsuit goes, that's a bit of old news, and it just shows you how fast these things move because it's not that old. But as far as the House resolution goes, Gail, does that still have any legs? Because
those where people are not very focused on those issues right now, and in this new administration, one of the things that has been sort of a disappointment at the local level is that we're still waiting for the 5th FCC commissioner to be appointed, and so we're not seeing a lot of positive movement. Not that can't change, but we haven't seen that resolution or those sort of efforts to overturn the FCC rules, and it's probably referring to the small cell order to have those overturned. That was at the same time that the legislation, that the order was before the courts. The courts did strike some of it, as Tripp mentioned. An appeal to the Supreme Court was, cert petition was denied, so the Supreme Court didn't take up the issue, and we're sort of stuck with that order until there's either legislation or some action on the FCC, but we're not that hopeful at this moment.
We don't like to hang our stars on Congress right now.
Yeah.
Are there any active lawsuits right at the moment from any cities on the West Coast?
Yes, there are, and Gail and I are both involved in them. There's a whole series of FCC orders you saw at the back of the list of that slide about key FCC decisions related to eligible facilities requests. The earlier of the two, the declaratory ruling, is subject to a lawsuit currently pending in the Ninth Circuit. The later of the two, the 2021 or 2021 order.
They're both 2020.
Yeah, they're both 2020 now, I guess. Yeah, that's right. That one is not subject to litigation, but subject to a pending petition for reconsideration and Gail might be able to add more flavor on that one.
Yeah, that's reconsideration by the Federal Communications Commission. So when they issue an order, you can either appeal it or you can ask for reconsideration. If there's any reconsideration, then the FCC will, have a second look at it. But again, that hasn't really moved either because the FCC only has 4 commissioners right now, and so they're not taking up any matters that are all that controversial.
Are any of these active lawsuits about the shot clock, which I think we're all finding like we're getting something very uncomfortable?
Right. No, the shot clocks, the original FCC order that established the first set of shot clocks in 2009, that we were involved in the appeal of that order. It was unsuccessful. The order was upheld, and the FCC just saw that as a green light, and they've never-ending shot clocks ever since. So that's the hardest part. They're presumptively, under Section 332, it's a presumptively reasonable period within which to act. So you can make a case for, in your particular circumstances, having needed more time, and that it would be reasonable that you need more time. But it's kind of more of a case-by-case basis. And the thing that's really done harm, I think, to cities is that at the state level, that deemed granted remedy, that flips the burden on the local authority. If you get a letter saying, hey, you missed the shot clock, the application should be deemed granted, then it puts the burden on the local authority to go to court or otherwise challenge that deemed granted within 30 days. So it's pretty draconian.
And how often do people file for an extension for the shot clock?
It's pretty routine that applications do not come in complete the first time around, but that has a bad impact too, because every review eats into that shot clock period, and you're just spending time trying to get to a complete application. So that can be kind of bad, but it does help to give you more time that you can stop the shot clock when you issue the letter. The other thing is that applicants will sometimes agree to pause the shot clock or extend it, but you're really at their mercy in those circumstances because they don't have to agree.
Right. I mean, the key is really knowing where you are and when the shot clock is about to expire and asking for more time if you need it at the right time.
I see. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Gail, thank you for your questions and your comments. All right, let's bring this back to council, see if we can get some definitive direction on this. So Jeff, you're suggesting that we go ahead and make sure that we here deal with the 2 and the 4 and A. Is that it? I'd also think maybe 3.
Yeah, I think the bifurcation to me is really A for us and B and C for the Planning Commission. And maybe there's a tiny bit of overlap in some of the B and the C stuff, but I think that Commissioner LePage got it exactly right. I think, our concerns are about aesthetics, and I agree with him that stuff can be found in the design guidelines. So that's how I would see it.
I'd agree. Council, what is your preference? Thumbs up, thumbs down? I'm up.
Once again, this is the aesthetics with the Planning Commission, but having something to react to, I think is really important. So,
Mr. Mayor, could I ask for a little bit of clarification? Because I think I understand where you're going, but we're going to be the staff working with them to bring it back. Would that be okay?
Yep.
Thank you. So I definitely understand that we're going to take a swing. Councilmember Tice said, take a swing at basically answering all these questions, coming back with something to discuss. My question would be bifurcating them, A on its own track and B and C on its own track. Would you council like to see us take B and C and work on those with the Planning Commission, and then also at the same time be working on A with the City Council, and then ultimately kind of stitch that back together once we get answers from the 2 in drafting the ordinance? Or do you want to see us take B and C and get answers on them first before we come back to the council to work on A.
Well, just under the question of bandwidth, then my understanding was we were going to go ahead and authorize outside counsel to go ahead and deal with the legality issues. So I don't think it'd be that heavy on your department as far as going and doing both. I think the input we'd be getting from A would be from legal counsel.
Mm-hmm.
B and C would be more in your workshop.
That's true. I'm less concerned about the bandwidth because this is very important. I'm more concerned about just the timing. If the city council would like us to run to the ground B and C before coming back to the city council and working on A, so that in case you have questions about B and C, or if you want those two happening on separate tracks at the same time.
I think what's most effective and most expeditious would be best with me. If you can get them both there together, great. If not, then we'll have to bifurcate it a little bit. But I do think if we can get this resolved quicker, sooner than later. I mean, hell, it's only been 20 years.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, Mayor, this is Brian. I've got a suggestion and a question. My suggestion in terms of process would be, from what I'm hearing from the council, take B and C to the Planning Commission for them to discuss. And then after they've discussed it and given whatever direction they feel is appropriate, then bring it back to the council with a report on what the Planning Commission recommendations are on B and C. And at that meeting, also have the council weigh in on the items under A.
Exactly. Because then we'll know what we have as far as legal parameters go and what level of comfort we have with the recommendations that come out of the Planning Commission for implementation.
All right, there's two related questions. One is, would you want your special counsel to present to the Planning Commission a draft ordinance that they would then be able to review, and you could have, decision points where they could bookmark it, if you will, to say, okay, on this particular provision of the code, you could do A or you could do B, and seek direction, because otherwise it would just be discussion. And if we're looking to eventually end up with a work product, which would be the ordinance, perhaps a draft ordinance would be appropriate for the Planning Commission to consider, so they'd have something to.
I think it's an excellent suggestion, Brian, because otherwise it could be us against them. They'd go ahead and say this is what we want, but in a perfect world, if it's a perfect world, we get up and say it's not a perfect world. They'd know the confines in which they could propose regulations. I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Okay. Then the other piece would be, excuse me,
Jeff.
Yeah, I'd offer maybe a slightly different read on that, Brian, to you from me. I'm a little bit concerned about, with no offense to Mr. May, having Trip go and make the decision about, for example, ranking of zones, locations, and support structures. I think that's an important question, and I think that's a pretty difficult question. And I think that I would rather, like, for example, on that one, and probably most of the others, hear from the Planning Commission first, or at least from staff, because I think staff has a good read on what the commission might say on those items in B and C. Just maybe that would get us off on a slightly we would have a better start once we see the ordinance. I know that that's probably an extra meeting, but I think the first work product might be a little bit better and might set the mood of the project a little bit more.
Well, let me suggest a compromise that might kind of blend our two suggestions, and certainly defer to council on this one. There's much of the ordinance that wouldn't necessarily require answers to some of the questions you see in B and C. So my thought was that, as I tried to explain earlier, but maybe I wasn't very clear, those points that would require decisions and preferences and input could be left as placeholders without, let's take your zoning example. I think that's a good one. We would not have the lawyers make those decisions, but we would have them include a place in the ordinance where the Planning Commission could get input to the lawyers, and then based on that, they could, add whatever it is the input from the Planning Commission on those issues, so that it kind of puts some meat on the bones of the ordinance. Because if we don't have an ordinance, I think it makes the conversation a little more difficult. It's kind of like this slide you're looking at. The purpose of that was kind of to organize thoughts. And I think that the draft ordinance could do that as well, leaving obviously some of these undecided points, if you want to call them that, left open to be for the planning commissioners to provide input and allow the lawyers to then, draft it based upon their recommendations to the council.
Carrie, go ahead.
So I think we're kind of saying the same thing here. One thing is, I think there is suggestions for the ordinance and also suggestions for the policy. So it's not just, what I heard is it doesn't necessarily just need to be an ordinance. So I would like suggestions for the policy as well.
All right, Michael LePage, you have your hand up briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and maybe I'm not quite understanding what Brian is suggesting, but it seems to me it's important that we have an opportunity for the public to have input on these specific questions. And I was under the impression that Jeff's recommendation to separate out the B and C areas to the Planning Commission would provide that. I appreciate that Brian wants to come with sort of a draft ordinance, but I just feel like that's premature. And what I heard from the outside attorneys was that every town is specific. And if there was ever a specific town, it's our town, our community. So I just feel like I really would feel a lot more comfortable to have more of the public here to address these particular points, which I feel the attorneys have really done us a lot of a favor and a service by providing this to focus this. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Michael, once again, I don't think we're disagreeing. Brian, do you want to say something in defense? And then let's move this item.
Yeah, based on the comments that I've heard since I made my suggestion, I think that perhaps you could go without the draft ordinance with regards to coming back to the Planning Commission and have them give their input. And then once their input's been provided, then at that point, perhaps the draft ordinance could be prepared.
But I just don't want the draft ordinance coming to us with, we got to wedge in or cut up what the Planning Commission's recommended. I want that process to be collegial and collaborative too.
So it might be a two-step process then. The next time, the next event would be Planning Commission, discussion of items B and C, giving the commissioners and the public input on B and C and direction to the attorneys. And then the attorneys could draft an ordinance and come back with that to the council, as well as a discussion on the points under A.
All right, what are you thinking, guys?
Mr. Mayor, can I?
Yes, Robert.
Hey, just building on what Michael said, that I'm trying to think this through in terms of how do we maximize public input, and we've all made the point that there wasn't a lot tonight, whereas when we've had something very specific in front of us, a Verizon tower in front of La Playa, there was abundant public input. And I think any lack of it tonight is because we weren't discussing specific things, right? Yep. And it was very educational, and I do appreciate it. And I think the next step, as I'm understanding it, is for the Planning Commission to discuss specific things. And I was, when I first heard the idea of dealing with a starter kit, if you will, that is in the form of an ordinance, I liked that. And I think Michael's maybe saying, well, maybe you've gone too far and presumed too much there, and I'm fine with that. But I think the structure of what we do with the Planning Commission, it needs to be. I wouldn't want to make it too open-ended. I think I'd rather start with a statement or start with the end in mind, and get something out there that people can actually react to and say, I like that or I don't like that. as opposed to just giving us, shades of on a scale. And what I'm going with all this is perhaps some guidance from the city council. I heard Karen say that we ought to be putting together the most restrictive ordinance we can. And I wonder if the other four of you agree with that direction. I'll leave it at that.
All right. So council members, we've got direction, I think, here to go ahead and refer this to wherever we're going to go with this. Jeff, I think you're doing a good suggestion there. Brandon, do you have any idea what we want to actually say here for direction? You're going to pick it up. What do you hear?
I think I'll let Brian try to recap it because he kind of took over there and came up with an idea. So yeah, it was a little different than what I had said. So go ahead, Brian.
All right, now that I've heard additional comments, I'm still thinking that the idea of a draft ordinance we might want to wait on for now. We need a referral back to the Planning Commission for them to provide input on items B and C, and a staff report could go to the Planning Commission on items B and C. And I've heard the recent comments, maybe a little structure to it, and some information that would help guide the Planning Commission discussion on those points. So you wouldn't just, for example, give the Planning Commission a restatement of what's in B and C. You might elaborate a little bit on each of the points that are there. And that way, Planning Commission and the public will have a little more information as the Planning Commission works through that. So that's what I heard.
Based on the design guidelines, the staff should make some recommendations. Yes, that's what I'm hearing.
Or at least provide the information so that the Planning Commission can make its recommendations.
My desire would be that it is the most conservative approach as far as preserving our community character. I mean, I don't want us to come in and say we're just going to capriciously approve whatever the federal government's throwing away. I was at a League of California Cities meeting, Board of Directors meeting last week in Walnut Creek. And the attitude there is that we're losing all sorts of local control, whether it's housing being dictated from us down from on high to state level, or whether it's the wireless issues being set forth by the FCC. We're losing control of our communities. And this was a hot button there when I was up there last week, same thing. So we've got to get, there's strength in numbers. I do think that the points that were made about, let's go out, find out what these other communities are caring about. I'm going to the League of California Cities in Washington, D.C. I think it's like the 12th or 15th is this month. I think it's the 17th and the 18th, and Bobby's going to. And there's a item on there about the federal regulations on wireless communication. There's a topic that's going to be an interesting session to go to, I think. So anyway, I think we've done a good job tonight. I think we've got consensus. Is there anybody else that wants to add anything from the council level? All right.
I would only ask Mayor if Brandon feels that he has what he needs to take it to the Planning Commission with what he's heard.
That was a communication you were going to have with him just now. I think he does.
Yeah,
Brandon?
We're good. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So council, we've got a closed session coming up before us. Before Brian reads us into that closed session, I'm going to tell us we're going to take a 15-minute bio break so we can go and check the plumbing out and everything. Be back at 15 minutes from now, which is but we come back at 5:45. That work for everybody?
And obviously, Mayor, the Planning Commission won't be coming back for that, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
We're dismissed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Honestly, I want to thank you guys for taking the time. I know this is a very hot topic, but it's only going to be good. We're only going to be successful to work together on this, and I don't get a chance enough to thank you guys for all the hard work you do. As somebody who cut my teeth 6 years before I moved into stepping on the dark side, went over to the process world. I mean, I really enjoyed my years as being somebody who was on the ground floor trying to figure out how it could keep communities together. So thank you guys.
And I know I speak for all the planning commissions. We really appreciate you including us in this meeting tonight. Thank you.
All right, guys. Brian, you want us to read in a closed?
Sure. We have two closed sessions. One of them is conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation. That's initiation of litigation pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D4. The other closed session will be conference with labor negotiators pursuant to Government Code Section 54957.6. And Mayor, I believe I heard you right that we'll be considering those at 5:45.
Exactly. All right. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated. We will see the council and appropriate legal staff with us back when we come back into closed session.
You know, one more thing, Mayor, since I just read the closed session items, it'd probably be appropriate at this point to ask if there's any public comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to do that. Yes. Are there any public comments about the two items that we're going into closed session on? Yeah, I don't hear any. We'll now adjourn to closed session.
Mr. Mayor, I have a question about the closed session.
Okay, identify yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Michael McWalters, Scenic Road. If one of those numbers references the Verizon lawsuit, my comment is in 2019, Verizon wanted 5 permits for 5 cell towers. They were denied. Then there was an agreement to relocate 2 of them outside town, put 1 on the roof, and now there's I think 2 on the Sunset Center roof. And by their own actions, they validated our right as the Carmel-by-the-Sea taxpayers to decide where these towers go.
I don't mean to interrupt the speaker, but
I was going to do the same, Brian. Sir, I can guarantee you this is not about the closed session item. It is not, the Verizon issue is not before council in closed session tonight. This is about the threat of litigation, not pending litigation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and I apologize.
No problem. Nothing to apologize for. All right.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 15, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.